Hi everybody, welcome to Leading for Life Stories Season 2. My name is Bob Judson and I'm your host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Thanks very much, and I really hope you enjoy what follows. Welcome back everybody. In this personal stories episode, I thought I'd do something that hopefully is going to be of interest to those of you that are fascinated by flying, because it's one of those things that every time you talk to someone about being in the Air Force and they ask if you're a pilot and you turn around and say, yeah, I was a pilot, then they're interested in what you did and what kind of flying was going on and so on. And I've touched on that with some of the earlier episodes. But I thought I'd dedicate this one really to the joy of flying, because it was a huge part of my life and it really was an immensely pleasurable part of it as well. I mean, some tremendously exciting times in there and some very complex and challenging ones. But overall, it was just fabulous. And there's an age-old joke out there about how do you know if you've met a pilot, that actually he'll tell you. And that's kind of where I am with this, I suppose. I think it's going to be of interest to some of you. If it isn't, and you don't really want to know much about the flying world in the Air Force, then this is an episode for you. So you switch off now and come back to another one later on. But I really hope you enjoy it, because I'm going to try and bring some of the experiences to life. I mean, I was very lucky in the time that I was flying in the Air Force. I did just over 3,500 flying hours on a whole range of different types of airplanes, from training aircraft through a bunch of different fast jet types and some historic types. And I'll touch on all of that as we go through this, because I think they all, in their own way, were uniquely challenging, uniquely different, and very, very rewarding. And I also dealt with every role pretty much that the fast jet world has anyway. I started out in the strike role, in the nuclear role, which doesn't exist now because we've gone entirely to a submarine-based nuclear deterrent in the UK. But I also spent a lot of time doing bombing and attack missions, where we would obviously train with a variety of different weapons in a variety of different profiles. A lot of time doing reconnaissance. And then in the sort of latter part of my flying career, when I became a station commander at Coningsby, and not only did I have the huge privilege of flying on the Battle of Britain Memorial flight in the Spitfires and Hurricanes of the flight, but also actually had the chance to fly the Eurofighter Typhoon when it was brand new, it was just coming into service. And that was obviously in the air defense role in its early days. So getting to grips with a brand new role at that stage was definitely a challenge. And again, I've touched on that in a couple of my previous episodes, not least in the guise of imposter syndrome, because it was definitely a chance to have a bit of that. Types wise, what did I fly? I started out on the Jet Provost, flew the two different types of Jet Provost, the Mark III and the Mark V, then the Hawk at RAF Valley and at RAF Brawdy, and then jumped onto the Jaguar. And the vast majority of my flying career was really on the Jaguar. I did over 2,500 hours flying it, which is quite a chunk in fast jet terms, and in a wide variety of bases, wide variety of roles. And it was an airplane that I absolutely grew to love. I was incredibly fortunate to see a whole range of different upgrades through it as well. As I've again mentioned in a previous episode, I flew our Phantoms on exchange with the German Air Force at Bremgarten in southwest Germany, but also flew the UK Phantom, which was a completely different airplane. It was an air defense airplane with a very different type of radar, different engines, and quite a different cockpit layout to the German one. And so I had a bit of a taste of air defense in those very early days, albeit I only did sort of 25 hours or so on the Phantom OCU, when I was just learning to have a look at that before I went off to my exchange tour. And then after the Jaguar, as I say, Typhoon, and very much early days with Typhoon, Tranche 1 Typhoons, the early ones that we got. I picked a couple of airplanes up from the factory, though. That was amazing to go and pick brand new airplanes up. It's just a bit like picking up a new car, but with slightly different floor mats. And it was huge privilege to do that. And obviously the Battle of Britain Memorial flight. So I was really lucky. Really lucky. I flew in Germany for a long time at low level when we were still able to do low level in Germany. Obviously, a huge amount of time flying around the UK. Tons of exercises all over the world where we did training events in a wide range of places over different times, and everything from flying in Jordan and flying at low level down Wadi Rum in Jordan was one of my small memories from that kind of time when I was a squadron commander. Also, lots of time in Canada flying on Maple Flag, big exercise over there, which we fly at 100 feet, training against every kind of threat and both airborne and ground-based threats. And that was just a tremendously exhilarating exercise. And Goose Bay in Canada as well, which I only ever flew there with the German Air Force. But again, it was a fascinating place to operate. We used to, in the old days, spend a lot of time flying into Sardinia and operated out of a base called Decima Manu in Sardinia, doing range work, bombing work and strafe and on a place called Frasca Range on the western coast of Sardinia. We also went there to do air combat training and in an instrumented range just off the western side of Sardinia as well, which was, in the early days, certainly the Germany time, that was where we did a lot of flying. And that was great. It was a fabulous place to operate. So in that sense, I was tremendously fortunate. Just if you take away all the overseas stuff and just look at the UK, I mean, flying around Scotland on a good day, flying around Scotland is just amazing. It does not get better. The wide open space, very few people there, lots of amazing terrain to operate in, particularly at low level. Obviously, flying down the valleys in Scotland, just fabulous, and the scenery takes your breath away every time. And it's one of those things that when you get used to it and you're used to flying around at low level, you've got plenty of time to look around and see what's there. And it really was just one of those things that I'll never, ever forget. It was just amazing fun to do that. In terms of the things that I think are probably of interest on the specifics of flying that I thought I'd just touch on, though, is I'll talk about a few things. I'll talk about low level a little bit more. I'll talk about supersonic flying, because I think that's always something that's interesting for people who've never done it. Formation flying, combat, air-to-air combat, and weapons, and doing weapons training. And all of those, I think, are kind of relevant elements to the flying world. I'm not going to talk through specific sorties. I'm just going to give some kind of highlights as to the sort of things that I think were memorable about it. The low-level flying we did in the Jaguar particularly was just the best. UK training down at 250 feet pretty much everywhere, including at night, actually. When I was the squadron commander of number 6 Squadron, we did the night workup with the Jaguar just with night vision goggles. It has no radar or anything other sensors. So, literally looking through a couple of night vision goggles to effectively image intensifying toilet tubes in front of your eyes. It was pretty challenging, to say the least, particularly on a darkish night, flying around in mountainous terrain. That really got your attention because you were earning your corn those nights. That's for sure. But it was again fabulous fun to do it. You just couldn't see quite as much, obviously, as you can during the day in terms of the sights on the ground. But if I look at low level overall, I mean, my first experience of low level way back in the Jet Provost, I can remember flying with an instructor where he sort of went, right, we'll demonstrate what you're going to start doing later on in the JP, and we flew down the North York Moors Railway, obviously in the North Yorkshire Moors, and at 240 knots at 250 feet. And at that stage, it was kind of complete sensory overload. You think, how on earth am I ever going to cope with this? Because your head's banging about, you're being thrown around in the airplane as he, contour flies down the valley. And, you start looking ahead thinking this is going to be pretty challenging. But amazingly, only a few months later, you're doing it yourself at 500 feet initially. And then once cleared, then once you at the tactical weapons unit on the Hawk, we were down at 250 feet. And in those early airplanes, the Jet Provost and the Hawk, you didn't have a radar altimeter. So the only way you could get height estimation was visually. You just looked out the window and gauged your height manually, because the altimeters, pressure altimeters, don't work at a very low level. They're not sensitive enough to pick up the ground and give you an accurate height. So the age-old saying was that if you can see the cow's legs properly, then you're at 500 feet. If you can see the sheep's legs, you're at 250 feet. Which works well unless there are no cows or sheep, of course, and then you obviously have to gauge it slightly differently, and you certainly have to be careful with some really dangerous optical illusions in some places. Canada would be a great example of that, albeit there we did have radar altimeters in the airplane to give you accurate heights. But if you looked at trees, for example, quite often you'd look at trees and make assumptions around what height they were, and you could find they were a dramatically different height to to the one you were expecting. And if that was shorter, then you could suddenly get yourself very close to the ground and not really realize you were doing it. So you did have to be very, very careful. We flew with a bubble around the airplane, essentially. So 250 feet wasn't just above, below you. It was all around the airplane. So you try to make sure that nothing penetrated that. Obviously, we didn't fly under things, but in valleys, etc., staying 250 feet away from the wall was important. And in narrow valleys, that was certainly important. You'd be going down. You had to pay close attention to am I scraping this a bit too close sometimes, and as we got the speed higher, and obviously our routing speed normally was 450 knots, something over 500 miles an hour, would frequently do target runs at 480 knots. And some of the time you'd fly faster than that. And if I combine a bit of low level with a bit of supersonic, probably one of the most amazing pieces of flying I did was in the German Air Force Phantom at low level in Goose Bay in Canada. Supersonic at about a couple of 100 feet, where we were doing 800 knots, well in excess of the speed of sound, and very, very close to the ground. No one, of course, up there at all. Nothing up there really. It was just rocky terrain rather than even any trees. Because in the northern no-fly zone there, you're pretty much north of the tree line. But it was just incredible, the sensation of speed. That's the only time really that I've felt that you genuinely had tunnel vision, because if you looked out the side, it was just flashing by at an amazing rate. But everywhere we did that kind of flying, it was incredibly exhilarating. And I touched on it when I talked about operations, that flying around in northern Iraq, when we first started doing ops there, we were at low level, and we were at very, very low level there too. And that really never ever got old. That was amazing, that kind of flying. It was just such fun to do, and so rewarding. It really did spike your adrenaline up on any day really, because you had to pay such close attention to what you were doing. You had to pay attention right from the planning process on to make sure that you were in the right place. You were aware of what the hazards were, where the masts were, where big pylons were, where there were things that just were going to get in the way, as it were. And obviously all the time we're flying around at low level. Essentially, almost wherever you are, you're operating with what's called visual flight rules. So you're just looking at see and avoid. You're looking out the window and avoiding other airplanes. There's no radar control. No one's giving you any direction down there. You are looking at trying to make sure you avoid everything else. And that's obviously everything military, but there are also plenty of civilian aircraft that operate down there. No civilian light aircraft, apart from getting airborne and landing, should be below 500 feet, but they do fly there. And so occasionally you'd catch glimpses of Cessnas that you wish you hadn't had, where they were rather too close and things like that. What was a real issue were things like hang gliders and microlights and parachutists, where obviously you definitely tried to make sure you avoided the areas that they were notified to be flying in, and that was easy because they were all on the map, and we had a system where we checked thing called NOTAMs, notices to airmen, which basically give you warning of things that are happening and stop you actually flying in those areas. They'll either give you a warning or they'll give you an avoidance, so you had to mandatory avoid it. But the problem was quite a lot of the time with things like microlights is that they had sites, they had declared sites that were all marked on our maps, but it wouldn't be at all unusual for them to turn around and think, okay, well, the wind's not optimal for us jumping off our planned site here, so we'll go to the next door hill 3 or 4 miles away and we'll jump off that. And of course, guess what? We're planning to avoid their site and go right near that hill. And those sorts of aircraft have almost no cross-section to see. So when you're flying, very quickly as we are, if they're pointing at you, then you go from nothing, you literally can't see it, to something that's filling your windscreen in an alarming short period of time. So paying attention to that and being really alive to those kind of risks was one of the really key things at low level all the time. And of course, we weren't just flying around. We had a job to do. We were definitely, every sortie was a training sortie of some sort. So we were flying targets to either photograph them or to practice bombing them. And often we're working with threat aircraft ourselves. So we'd work with either air defense airplanes that were coming in and having a look at what we were doing and trying to intercept us, or very frequently would actually be operating with our own so-called bounce aircraft. So another Jaguar typically, who would have your route. He knew exactly where you were going to fly. He'd come to your brief, or the main part of your brief, and you would then expect him to appear in all sorts of places around your route. And his job was to try and get into a shooting solution and simulated shoot you down. And our job was obviously to prevent that. So that was where the lookout thing was really, really key. And obviously all the time you're avoiding him and watching what he's doing and making sure you're fighting away the threat. You've got to make sure that the other big threat, which is the ground, stays at the requisite height away from the airplane. And that was a really key element of what we did. And I have to say, inevitably, and you don't go through 3,500 hours of flying without a few pretty hairy moments, and quite a lot of those were at low level, where I had some pretty near misses on occasion. But but for the grace of God, I think go just about all of us. I mean, sadly, obviously, along the way, I've known far too many people who have had accidents where they've flown into the ground, and that's just an absolute tragedy when it happens. But that was the kind of, I suppose, the price to some extent of the training we were doing. It was very high tariff training, and we were working at the most demanding end of it. So it was it was a really challenging arena to operate in, but at the same time, just so exciting. Supersonic flying, I have to say, is really interesting with supersonics. Everyone thinks I was going supersonic must be a big deal, and when obviously lots of people were going flying in Concorde when Concorde was around, if you could afford to do it, and I would love to have had the opportunity to do that. I certainly never did. But to be honest, going supersonic in an airplane designed to go supersonic is a very overrated experience, because actually all you're really seeing is the Mach meter, the number that tells you've gone from 0.999 Mach to 1.00 Mach, just goes through there. That's it. In some of the slightly less supersonic designed airplanes, so the Hawk would be a good example, the Jaguar would be another one, where they're really transonic. They'll just about go through the Mach, but they're not designed to operate there. Then you might notice a bit of a blip on the instruments, and you would see a bit of maybe a bit of a jolt as you went through the sound barrier. But frankly, in the cockpit, there was really no visible sign. And so it was one of those things that you thought, well, okay, it's once you've done it, you've ticked that box. It's it's not such a big deal. It was quite interesting though when we got into, getting into a Phantom, where obviously it's got much better supersonic capability. It can properly operate up as a Mach 2 aeroplane. You could really go through and operate for extensive periods of time supersonic. And the Typhoon, the same thing. The Typhoon would operate not only supersonic but also very high. So we could go up to 55,000 feet. Which is certainly the highest I've ever been in an airplane, and and you start seeing curvature of the Earth up there and things. I mean, it's most definitely you're getting a real sense of the world is spherical, and the airplane as well would operate. We could fly in the days I was flying it to Mach 1.6. And it would operate easily up to that speed, and doing that up at a maximum altitude. And even at that height, the fly-by-wire system in the airplane and the aerodynamics of the airplane made it incredibly maneuverable. I can remember flying in a Typhoon from Coningsby with the Pakistani chief of air staff, who was just visiting us for the day, and I took him flying, and we're up at 55,000 just because we could, and we're doing Mach 1.4, I think. And I said to him, okay, sir, just give it a full deflection stick roll. So do an aileron roll at that incredible altitude and also that speed. And he was an F-16 pilot of some experience, and had been flying the F-16 for a long time. And I couldn't see him because he sat behind me, but I could hear the astonishment in his voice when he said, "You want me to do what?" Because that's just not something you would do in most other airplanes. It was such a stable, capable airplane, the Typhoon, that you could literally do an aileron roll at that kind of speed, and it would be completely fine. Whereas flying supersonic, and even in the Phantom, actually up at high level, I did quite a lot of high level work up in the sort of up to about 40,000 feet in the German Phantom, and Yeah, it would get there and you could operate there, either high subsonic or in some instances supersonic, but you kind of felt like you were flying on the point of a pencil. It was very sensitive handling. If you weren't careful, then you'd wash speed off really quickly if you started a turn, or you'd find that it was just uncomfortable to fly. It was not anywhere near as stable and nice as the Typhoon was. So, lovely to do the supersonic thing, but to be honest, it was one of those things that it has a purpose. And the main thing we had to be concerned about, particularly in something like the Typhoon, was not inadvertently going supersonic, because the aeroplane has so much performance. It's got such powerful engines that particularly at lowish altitude, anywhere below about 10,000 feet, then without using the reheat, the afterburner in the aeroplane, it would go supersonic incredibly easily. And that obviously over land is a complete no-no, because although in the cockpit it's a very overrated experience where pretty much nothing is of significance happens. On the ground, of course, if the boom hits the ground, then you're into a lot of noise, breaking windows in some instances if you're low enough, and in making the national news, which is never really a good thing in our profession. So we would try very hard to avoid that. Although it did occasionally happen, every so often would have someone who would inadvertently drop a sonic boom, and obviously would be eating some humble pie and apologizing to people. Formation was the next thing I was going to come on to. I suppose that formation, most people look at the red arrows would be the classic, where there's the formation aerobatic team. That is the kind of demonstration vehicle of what close formation is all about to anyone that's not familiar with what the RAF does. And they take that to an art form. They do amazing maneuvers and do aerobatics in close formation. But in reality, on any fast jet squadron and through the training system, close formation is just a means to an end, by and large, to get you through cloud in multiples of more than one aeroplane. Why? Because if you've got 4 aircraft flying together, then by and large, you didn't want to saturate air traffic too much by having 4 separate so-called speaking units, everyone operating individually. It was much easier if we could operate together. And would do that, would fly, typically on a Jaguar squadron, would fly up to 3 aircraft in close formation at any one time, or 2 pairs if we had a 4-ship formation, and would always operate like that. So you'd be 2 speaking units talking to air traffic control to come back and recover into the airfield in poor weather. And sometimes the weather was really poor. When you drive in very thick fog is the closest analogy you can get to someone who doesn't fly, but really, really thick fog sometimes. So, the worst case, you'd be flying, you could barely see, you'd just see the wingtip of the airplane that you're actually formating on. And that was quite challenging if you got to that kind of level of cloud, because obviously you have to be very predictable as the leader, not make any sudden changes, because of you're not going to pick them up if you're in the aircraft that's hanging on the wing. So you need the leader to be very sympathetic to you. It's much easier if the cloud is obviously either not there at all, or if it's thin. But still, you obviously wanted to make sure that you stayed tucked in tight, so you're maintaining visual on your leader and just making his life as easy as possible. And what we would typically do is would fly, you'd close in at a sensible rate of closure to get yourself into a position where on the Jaguar you lined up the tips of the tailplane, so you could see those in line, and you had an aerial on the either the top or the bottom of the wing, depending on which side you were on, and a strobe light on the top of the aeroplane, and you basically put those in a line. So you had a triangle that you were creating between that tailplane, the 2 tailplane tips, and the wing aerial and the strobe light. And if you got those all lined up, you were perfectly in position. And that meant that the other guy on the other side, if he'd done the same thing, would also be in position, and it looked very pretty. And when you did fly pasts for big things, like, for example, Buckingham Palace, when you're doing the Queen's birthday fly past, you'd do that, but just to a more advanced level with bigger formations, working out specific references. If you're doing something really special, like 100th anniversary of the Air Force, for example, when they wrote 100 in Typhoons, or did E2R for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, then those were special things where you actually have to work out what the references are going to be, work out how you're actually going to get everyone into the right formation. And then what you'd also use, you'd use a thing called a whip. You'd have another aircraft and his job would be to fly generally above the formation and look at it and give specific instructions to individual airplanes to move them left, right, forward, back, up, down, as appropriate, depending on what he could see, to make sure the formation looked just as it should do. And then once you got it looking right, then he'd make sure that you knew that was good. And then you identified, you had to pick specific references on the other airplane that you were going to then hold to and keep those right for the rest of the formation that you were actually doing. So, because obviously you don't want the whip flying over the top of the formation all the way into going down the Mall, for example, to do a Buckingham Palace fly past. So once you've got the references sorted, the whip departs, and you're left with the rest of the formation going and doing its thing. And again, fabulous fun to do close formation. It's one of those things. Initially, you tend to over control. You tend to be really gripping the stick really, really tightly, and it's a huge challenge to get it right. But once you learn to relax and you make small movements with the controls, and you're really in the zone, as it were, staying on the wing of another airplane, then it was glorious fun to do. It was just tremendous. And just exhilarating. Exhilarating is the only right word for it, really. Particularly when you're doing a big fly past event. I was lucky enough in 2006. I led the 49 aircraft fly past for Her Majesty the Queen's 80th birthday, and that was over Buckingham Palace with all those aeroplanes, and I was obviously in a typhoon, but just the thrill of putting it all together and making it work on the day and getting everyone over the palace on time was a big deal. It was just tremendous fun to do. And again, one of those things that, frankly, you never got bored of doing it. It was great sport. I really hope you've found it interesting to hear some of this flying stuff. It was as I say, a pivotal part of my working life for the vast majority of it, really. And I am passionate about it. I don't fly these days. Lots of people say to me, "Do you fly now?" And I don't. And for a variety of reasons, I don't. I don't because I have a private pilot's license, but the opportunities to actually fly and do any meaningful flying are just kind of not really there in the southeast of England. There's, I find I could go and fly at a local flying club and go and do some cross-country flying, things like that. But that just doesn't hold any huge appeal for me in terms of the kind of thing that I used to do in the comparison. So it is just different, I think. And I'm not sure I'd want to go back and do that. I live with some amazing memories of some amazing flying over a lot of years, and that leaves me with a great view in the rearview mirror that I keep that way. But it's been great to relive some of this for this now. I think there are some other chapters that we can bring into this as well. I'll probably talk specifically about historic flying at some point, Spitfire and Hurricane, because that was just, again, a whole different world, incredible opportunity to do that. And I didn't come on and talk about weapons, and I think that's definitely something that weapons employment, both offensively and defensively, in air-to-air combat and what we do with that. I think the kind of tactical employment of the airplane, ultimately, in terms of doing what it was designed to do, is another area that's worth some discussion. But I really hope it's been good. And as ever, if you're listening this far, I'm delighted. Thank you very much indeed. I really, really appreciate your support with everything to do with the podcast. And have a great week. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Bye.